Hello, this is Digital Accessibility, the people behind the progress. I'm Joe Walensky, the creator and host of this series. And as an accessibility professional myself, I find it very interesting as to how others have found their way into this profession. So let's meet one of those people right now and hear about their journey. All right, well, welcome back to another episode where I get the opportunity to speak with an accessibility practitioner. And today I'm pleased to be speaking with Richard Morton. Hi, Richard, how are you today?
Hi, Joe. Yeah, thanks for inviting me. I'm good, thanks. Yeah.
Well, I am, as mostly usual, in my home office on Vashon Island, which is near Blink's Seattle headquarters. Where are you talking to me from?
I'm talking to you from Birmingham, England, in the UK. As I say, in the centre of England. Yeah, so it's nice and sunny here today as well.
All right, great. Well, I've had the opportunity to visit there one time and enjoyed that. And it's great to be able to have some perspectives from the UK for this podcast. I appreciate you getting involved. One of the best places to start would be if you could just talk a little bit about the things that you're involved with right now.
Sure, yeah. I mean, what I do is try and build accessibility capability across the UK government. That's my role, if you like. It's mostly cross-government, so it's the different departments within central government, the national government, if you like, and it's helping to get teams to understand what the needs for accessibility are, raising awareness about that, helping to understand the regulations, the laws that are in place, and giving them tips and techniques for how to make things accessible, but also trying to, as I say, build capability through things like training, through things like accessibility empathy labs we run, through things like clinics we run where people come to us with questions. We do it through lots of different routes, I guess. But there are UK government split up into lots of departments and smaller organisations, and reaching those is quite a difficult task. So one of the things we do is we run a community of professionals across government, digital professionals, not necessarily accessibility specialists. Well, I guess most of them aren't actually, because there's around 1,600 people in that group, and they share experiences, ideas, raise questions. And the idea is that, it makes it more efficient, makes it a better process for people getting to understand this stuff, particularly because people come into government or come into the public sector with not much knowledge about accessibility. That's probably being polite, very little knowledge in many cases, because the private sector doesn't necessarily do this terribly well. There are good examples in larger organizations, things like that, but a lot of the small organizations just don't know about this stuff. And it's not really known in academic institutions either. It's not taught in computer science degrees or in design degrees, those sort of things. So we're constantly having to sort of train people and raise awareness. So that's the big thing is, as I say, building capability.
Well, on your LinkedIn profile, you have your current title as Head of Accessibility for Government. Is that the right? That sounds like a really, really broad, far-reaching position.
It kind of is. It's more sort of, it just means it's a cross-government role. It doesn't mean I head up a massive team across government or anything like that. It's an informal title, if you like, across government. So it's a sort of, we're a centre of expertise for accessibility, but we're supported by a lot of other professionals across. There are a group of, 50 or 60 accessibility professionals across government, and there are leaders in other departments, some of the bigger departments. So we all work together. So it's more about coordinating, running the communities, building things through blogs, that sort of thing. And through the communities, we also have meetups. We have talks where we, get people to talk about their projects they've been working on, but also get external speakers in as well. And that helps give, a different perspective on things.
All right, great. Well, one of the things I like to do with this podcast is to find out how people ended up where they are today. So maybe you could go back in time and pick out maybe the first milestone where you became aware of accessibility as a profession. It would be a good place to start.
Sure. I mean, I've been in IT for a long time now, getting on for 40 years, but probably about the last 16 years of that have been as an accessibility specialist. And that started when I was working on testing for other companies for websites. So compatibility testing, if you like, making sure that websites worked, making sure they worked across different browsers, making sure they did what functional specifications said, things like that. And it was just general testing to start with, general functional testing, general usability testing. And it developed into accessibility testing because the demand was there from certain clients. So I pretty much became self-taught in how to do that about 16 years ago. And I ran my own business for a long time, doing that for various agencies, design agencies, but testing agencies in particular. And they had clients in mostly the commercial sector, actually, not so much in sort of public sector and government. Then 6 years ago,
it's so it sounds like you're able to find your own path with that. Was there something about the accessibility part of the testing that particularly intrigued you, where you began to do more and more of that type of work?
To a degree, yes, but I think, to be honest, it was largely market driven, if you like. The work, that was where the work was. You know, there was limited amount of ordinary testing or general testing, so I went where the market took me, and that's that. But my interest developed over time, and this was, you know, originally with the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines version 1 when I started, and that changed obviously back in 2008, I think it was, to version 2. So there's a whole learning curve, and had to learn about assistive technologies, had to learn about why we do this stuff. Maybe did it in a sort of slightly backwards way, if you like, but that's often what happens with these things, isn't it? You fall into these things by accident. You can do, yeah.
And so then, as you pursued that accessibility testing area, you know, essentially what was going on at that time? Were you being engaged to review certain digital products and services and identify whether things were in compliance, or were you also getting involved in the design of those systems?
It wasn't so much the design. I mean, I did some design on my own for small clients. I did develop and design some websites and try to make sure those were accessible. But this was mostly what you call web accessibility auditing. So it was particularly, you know, using the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, using also things like Section 508, the US standards, and auditing sites, organizations who are going through a build process, if you like. And it was often, you know, often as is the case with these things, it was towards the end of the project where they decided they needed to do accessibility testing. So it was usually the case that there were a lot of issues to be found, and I would do the tests, write a report, and then often present it to the developers and designers and go through things with them. And that tended to be a sort of educational thing for them, because they often just didn't know this stuff. So it wasn't a case of, oh, yeah, thanks for pointing that out. They needed to get to grips with why is this important, or what is this about? You know, why does it matter whether something only works with a keyboard, for example? That sort of thing. It was that basic in a lot of cases. So I had to obviously refine how I did that.
Well, you mentioned Section 508, which is related to specifically to United States legislation. Yeah, that was something that I've always been interested in, is, you know, I guess how important the Section 508 was in terms of things that happened in the UK versus what came out of the W3C, which is a little bit more broadly international. And then I know you have your own national standards for that as well. So maybe you could talk a little bit about, you know, what actually you had to audit against.
Yeah, in terms of Section 508, it was specifically for US clients or global clients based in the US, if you like. So that was why that happened. For the UK, it was mostly the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines that we audited against. Also, in some cases, specific internal company guidelines or organizational guidelines. Yeah, so we worked with whatever guidelines we had. They're quite similar in many ways. WCAG 1 was quite similar to Section 508, and WCAG 2 is now similar to the current Section 508. So there's a lot of overlap between that, but always with the emphasis of going beyond specific compliance and into, you know, best practice and things like that. So not just pointing out something that had to meet a particular requirement, what's the best practice in that area, what's the best way of doing it. So it would be about not just pointing out what the issue was, but pointing out what the potential solution was. Obviously not saying you have to do it this way. There's usually multiple ways to do something, but for example, giving examples of colors that would work, you know, in terms of color contrast, that sort of thing.
Mm-hmm. And was there a community of accessibility colleagues that you worked with to learn about and get ideas from? Has accessibility grown up within the UK as a place where people look at it as an active place to be involved as a professional?
Yeah, I mean, I guess it was quite a small group back in whatever year it was, 16 years ago, but it's grown since then. It's still a small profession, if you like. It's not a massive profession, it's a small profession, but there's a whole community out there, and you know, I'm in touch with most of them through things like Twitter, but other connections as well. And it's a very collaborative community. You know, people are very willing to share ideas and experiences and how they do stuff, and you know, things around new guidelines coming out, for example, or new legislation. There's a lot of sharing going on, and you know, I think people are in it more for the greater good than just individual self-interest, if you like. I mean, obviously people have to work to make money, but they're usually very willing to share. And you know, as a result of that, there's a lot of conferences go on. There's been some great ones recently, like AXCON went to, and I spoke at last year. They become sort of global. Particularly with COVID, it's made it easier to do these things online more rather than face to face, so more people can get to them. So there's been a sort of real growth, particularly in the last couple of years, that I've seen, that's been fantastic. I mean, it's now sort of there's a season of things coming up over the next couple of months. We have Global Accessibility Awareness Day coming up in mid-May, which leads to a raft of events going on that week. So that's really good. So as I say, there's great collaboration going on, yeah.
And so then what followed on from the consulting? Is that where you moved into work with the government?
Yeah, I got invited to come into GDS to sort of see if I would be able to help them with accessibility. The head of accessibility then asked me to come in, and yeah, I joined about 6 years ago, well, just over 6 years ago, at the Government Digital Service. Been working there ever since, apart from the fact that we moved to a different organisation last year called the Central Digital and Data Office, but we're all part of the UK Cabinet Office, which is part of this sort of central government. Yeah, and they asked me to come in to help make sure that things like gov.uk was accessible. Gov.uk is kind of a shining example of accessibility. It was built with accessibility in mind, but obviously over a few years, it's changed and developed, and lots of new things, lots of new features, lots of new products as well had come in. And so it was the case that it needed not quite a reboot, but it needed looking at in more detail again. So I came in to help with that. There were initially just the two of us, and then we built a team, and we started to do more and more things around the internal stuff, gov.uk, and the pay service and things like that. But then we did an investigation or research, if you like, into what were the needs of the rest of government, teams across government. And we knew what the answer was, but the research proved that they needed a lot of help in building capability. They were all they all had good intentions. They wanted to make things accessible, but they just didn't have the knowledge of how to do this. They didn't know when to do it. They didn't know what the techniques were. They didn't know who needed to do what at what stage, all those sort of things. So that's where we went next, if you like, to build capability through things like training.
And in the UK, is there a legislative directive about government organizations being accessible? Because that's really what the kind of Section 508 and other parts of the legislation are for the federal government in the United States. So yeah, that's similar where those organizations you're talking about really do need to be in compliance with that?
Yeah, sure. I mean, it's been for a long time now. There's been a thing called the Disability Discrimination Act, which says you can't discriminate against people with disabilities in terms of services. And that's not just in the public sector, that's across the private sector. That developed and became the Equality Act, which protected against 9 different characteristics, including disability. But then more recently, there's been what's called the Public Sector Bodies Accessibility Regulations, which came out in 2018. And those are what you were just hinting at, which say the public sector has to make things accessible to a particular standard, which effectively is the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines version 2.1 level AA. And this came out of the European Union. It was a directive from the European Union for all the EU member states, and obviously the United Kingdom was a member state at the time. This was before Brexit, before we left the EU. So we created this legislation in our own laws, and that is now in place. And all public sector bodies, with the exception of 1 or 2 smaller ones or certain types, broadcasters, public broadcasters, most of them have to follow this legislation. And it's about making their websites and documents and internal services accessible to everyone according to the sort of principles of accessibility, but following a particular standard. There is a monitoring body for this, which sits within our organisation at the moment, and that goes around and checks public sector websites. It does it on a sampling basis rather than, it isn't possible to check all of the public sector. There's tens, probably hundreds of thousands of websites across the public sector, which is changing every day. So they do it on a sampling basis. They deal with complaints from members of the public or members of internal staff, and they can check. They can audit websites. They also audit mobile applications, so native applications, and they can audit things like documents as well. Yeah.
And is it then that the lead officers of the different government offices know that they have that responsibility, and that then they identify their own ways to be able to support accessibility? I guess that might include checking in with your office for guidance.
Yeah, I mean, we can provide them with support in a sort of informal way, but it is ultimately up to each individual public sector organisation to make sure they're meeting the regulations, however they want to do that. They basically have to meet the standards. We provide guidance in how they can do that, and we help them wherever we can. There's a limit to what we can do, obviously, but we ran a campaign for the last 2 years, ending last autumn, to try and raise awareness across the public sector. And it was quite a lot of work we put in to do that, because the public sector just wasn't aware of this stuff, and it was a big thing, a big change, if you like. Yeah, so it's certainly worked in the sense that we've seen improvements in accessibility. There's probably a lot of work still to go. It's not the be all and end all. And of course, it's about compliance, and compliance isn't everything. Compliance is only the sort of bare minimum of what needs to be done to make something accessible. That's something I constantly tell people. This is just the bare minimum. Don't focus on this and think this is all we've got to do.
I know in the United States we have our equivalent, the digital service that is responsible for similar things in the United States government. And I know they put out specific guidance or maybe recommendations on best practices, and I was wondering, does your office do things with trying to get off other agencies to use certain templates or certain best practices? I imagine it's extremely difficult to have any type of standardization across, as you mentioned, potentially hundreds of thousands of sites.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we've tried to sort of create resources that help. So guidance around the regulations, what people need to do specifically, because of the regulations just written in legal form and that. So we've provided guidance for that. We've provided us a campaign of raising awareness and training that talks about it and what people's responsibilities are. And we're constantly trying to sort of raise awareness amongst individual digital professionals about their need to take on their own part of this responsibility. So a developer has a certain responsibility, a designer has a certain responsibility. We actually work with the US 18F organization to help sort of create some of the best practice guidance. We work with them on theirs, and we use that as a sort of backbone for some of our stuff as well. And so, as I say, there's collaboration globally on some of these things as well. And we created a guide to the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines to make it what we called a WCAG primer, which was to make it simpler for teams to understand their responsibilities and what to do, because the WCAG guidelines can be a bit dense and difficult to understand. And we're doing more work on that now, actually, to try and sort of work out how we interpret those guidelines in terms of regulations monitoring, so that we can be consistent about it, but also that can lead to hopefully a better understanding of what works and what doesn't work, So yeah, we've done quite a lot of work, I think, on trying to build up resources that people can use and encouraging them to do that. And as I say, things like just a simple thing we run is, as I say, a clinic, which we do every week, which is open to anyone across the public sector. We do it by appointment, and it's just an hour, but it gives people an opportunity to talk about the issues they might be facing, or the plans they've got, or just ask us about the regulations. And it's surprising how much you can get done in an hour, how much you can learn in an hour about a project and stuff. And we've done other things like create what we call accessibility personas to try and simulate some of the barriers that people might face. And that's helped teams with testing, for example, so that they can test against a screen reader or something like that. We always point out that this isn't a real life experience, but it helps people get an idea of some of the barriers people face, and it can eliminate some of the basic errors, things like that. So yeah, we're constantly trying to do that.
Well, you've been involved in this for quite a while now. Looking toward the future, are there any certain initiatives that are happening in the government, or things that your own organization is looking forward to, moving into the future? Or another aspect to that is like, how much have you seen things change? Are there certain areas that you think still deserve more funding or resources than have currently been applied to it?
I think that, to be honest, there's been a big focus, as I say, on the regulations and how that affects organizations. And that focus has been largely on the public facing side of things. So people's websites, people's information that faces the public or goes out to the public. There hasn't been so much of a focus on internal systems. And I think that's one area that needs a lot of work, is how accessible are your internal systems? They often rely on products that are procured from the private sector. So we're relying on those being accessible and, not needing too much customization or changes. And that's difficult. That is challenging. As I say, there are providers who are providing products that are good, but there are plenty of smaller products that need a lot of work. And it's kind of partly around raising awareness in the private sector as well, which we've been doing some work on to try and raise awareness of not their sort of legal obligations, but the fact that their market is impacted by the fact that the public sector needs to make sure the products they buy are accessible and meet the needs of their internal staff, public servants, civil servants, and I think that's going to be a big challenge to continue to do that. It's something we've been doing work on, but there's kind of a long way to go. I think related to that, one of my bugbears, if you like, is the number of documents that are out there that aren't accessible. You know, mostly PDFs, not just PDFs, but mostly portable document format PDFs that may not need to be PDFs for a start. We discourage the use of them wherever possible, but where they are used, you know, we want to make sure that they've been treated as being made accessible from the start, if possible. But there are literally thousands of them being produced probably every month, so it's a big task. So there's a lot of work still to do on that. Yeah.
Well, Richard, I want to thank you for taking the time to chat with me about the things going on in your organization in the UK, and hopefully we can meet in person at some point. Maybe if I'm in the UK or you're in the United States.
Yeah, great. That'd be cool.
All right. Thanks a lot.
Thanks very much, Jay.